gentlemen, welcome to a very special edition of India at 75 for the New Indian Express. We're celebrating 75 years of India's independence. We're looking back, looking forward. We have two gentlemen who really understand the armed forces, the nature of warfare, how it's changed. Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam and Lieutenant General H.S. Panag. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. And we really would like to get into it right away. Let's talk about the nature of warfare itself and how it's changed. And if I may, I'd like to begin with General Panag. For instance, the Operation Kabaddi that you led. Now, that wasn't a regular war, but, it was a limited effort or limited warfare. So has the nature of war in the 21st century really changed, and what are the new rules of engagement we're looking at?
The last major decisive war was probably the Gulf War 1 and 2, where particularly Gulf War 1, where large-scale forces were used. Now, since then, large-scale forces have not been used, and the wars have not been decisive as they used to be by total annihilation of the enemy or making it capitulate.
Right.
And the use of force today is for very specific purposes, for very short durations, and it is based on very high-end military technology. And this is the trend that we are witnessing all over the world. So that is why when people talk of an all-out war with China or an all-out war with Pakistan, it's highly unlikely that an all-out war would take place, particularly between nuclear powers.
Yeah.
Like in the subcontinent and with China, we are all nuclear powers. At some stage, nuclear weapons will come into play. Of course, people have been arguing that below the nuclear threshold there is a window and all. It is there, but the risk is so much, and that is why the application of force in future will be short duration for a specific aim and with high-end military technology.
Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, may I bring you in here? Since you're a war historian, you've written extensively on India's wars in the past. What are the lessons that we could learn from them going forward?
Thanks for having me on the show, Kaveree. But before that, I'd like to sort of endorse every one of the points that General Panag brought in. And there is only one addition that I'd like to make to his narrative, and that is never before have political outcomes been so important in the employment of force as an instrument of statecraft.
Right.
In the absence of the possibility of any decisive victories or defeats, ultimately it is political outcomes that is going to control or that is going to dictate how nations use force as an instrument of statecraft. That is why, unlike earlier, wherein militaries with large asymmetries could employ force with a kind of a cowboyish or even a gung-ho attitude.
Right.
Today, those kind of approaches are just not possible. So therefore, greater calibration, greater use of technology, looking at outcomes right from the word go, even by generals, air marshals, and admirals. In the past, what happened is that militaries did their bit, and then diplomacy kicked in, and the political outcomes were thereafter crafted.
Right.
We have no such flexibility in today's conflict milieu. Right. It has to be full spectrum operations and a whole of government approach that looks at the employment of force with great calibration and care.
Right.
Now, you asked about what are the lessons that we can draw. No, I think that's a huge landscape.
Yeah.
So let me bring out a couple of quick lessons.
Yes.
The first is that I think the Indian application of force since independence has been responsible and restrained. But at the same time, that has left us vulnerable to surprise and preemption. And I think in recent years, while we continue to espouse the principle of responsibility and restraint, but I think there is also an emerging narrative or dialogue that is increasingly taking place of saying that, look, if India is to be a rising power of consequence, I think it needs to relook at several concepts of deterrence, coercion, and compellence, and see whether we can migrate from a policy of excessive restraint and diffidence to a certain proactive approach to the application of force. And when you talked about Operation Kabaddi that General Panag was actively involved in, that was a reflection that this approach within India's military has existed for quite some time.
Right.
There have
not just suddenly overnight with Uri and, as everybody thought.
Absolutely not. I'm to say commanders such as General Panag, General Nanavati, and the others have been thinking over years as to how best we can seize the initiative and how best one can look at proactive approaches to the employment of force.
Right. General Panag, of course, I'd like to bring you in here and talk a bit about this idea that how important is it for any nation to have such sort of aggression ingrained in the DNA of their armed forces?
I think by nature, armed forces well understand that the one who seizes the initiative, and retains it, has got a head start.
Right.
Okay. The other side has to then react. In fact, if somebody, I often used to say that the most important leadership quality a leader must have is initiative. Is to initiate action, and initiate action first. So make the other side react.
Right.
While Arjun mentioned that we were earlier late in the sense that in 47, 48, the Chinese, started the Pakistani raiders came first, then we respond.
Right.
In 65 again, it was a response situation from what they were doing in Kashmir or Ran of Kutch. It was a response situation. 62 also, to a great extent, we responded to what the Chinese were doing rather than initiating. But Bangladesh definitely remains an exception.
Absolutely.
In the sense that we, right from the word go, we had taken, appropriate action, both for a people's war, then shaping the battlefield, and finally the lightning campaign of 13 days. IPKF again was initiative taken by us. It was not, we were not reacting to a situation. It was an understanding.
Yeah.
Kargil, we reacted. I mean, we were caught by surprise.
Absolutely.
And in Eastern Ladakh, the reaction.
Yeah.
We were caught. I mean, in the sense that we have been talking about this situation that a preemption can take place along the LAC or along the LOC for that matter. And we should always be prepared with reserves, and we should preempt the preemptor, or be there. But again, in Eastern Ladakh, sad to say that in the areas which were along the LAC and where no troops were physically deployed because main defenses are a little far behind because those areas are suitable for defense, the Chinese just walked in.
Yeah.
In the area of, they came up to crossroads in Depsang Plains. They came down into the Kugrang River, and even from finger 8 to finger 4. Back in 1988, when I took the first contingent of mechanized infantry, mechanized forces of 1 in mechanized battalion and 2 squadrons to Ladakh in 1988. That was follow-up of the Sundarongshu incident, and General Sundarji was very keen that we put mechanized forces there. And Sirijap used to be my preemptive task.
Oh.
That means at that time, the Chinese were far away. They were not forward, and they were not so aggressive on the LAC. But it was Sirijap was my preemptive task, and since there was no road running, from Phobrang along this even up to finger 4, and you couldn't cross finger 4 anyway. So since the BMPs are amphibious, So we wanted to do this action at night, swimming across the Pengong on the BMPs to capture Sirijap.
Wow.
So if this was thought of by us almost 33 years ago,
Yeah.
I find no reason as to why we should have been surprised. So this whole thing about being surprised at even the strategic level or tactical level, and then not being able to once you come to know, able to act before the enemy acts. I think this is something that we must learn.
Right.
And there's no point responding. Once you respond, then the game changes.
And Marshal, this is such an interesting point. Even internally, we saw in 2611 how we were so late to respond with the NSG. Are these not lessons that we will ever learn?
No, the thing is, I've always I have a thought mulling in my mind, which I call the elephant awakens. and we do have periodic eras wherein there are several commanders, as I mentioned. There are also at times accompanying political establishments that want to be more proactive in our approach. Okay, for example, let me take you back 1 year before General Panag, moved his mechanized forces, was in charge of mechanized forces in Eastern Ladakh. I think we lost out on a wonderful opportunity after the Sundarang-Chu crisis. Now, let me not, I wouldn't like to be despondent or negative about these issues, because I also want to highlight that at several times in India's recent military history, there have been combinations of the political executive and the military who've taken decisions that are truly proactive and that have even to the point of being spectacular. For example, if you look at the occupation of the Saltoro Ridge in 1984, it was a spectacular operation by the Indian Army, supported by the Indian Air Force, to seize a set of strategic heights that have been very difficult to hold on to for the last 30 years plus, and they have been a drain on the exchequer. But then when you look at India-Pakistan, when you look at the India-Pakistan-China conundrum, ego and prestige is extremely important. Is extremely important as a strategic tool.
Right.
Now, if you look at 1967, the Nathula firefight that took place. I mean to say, had it not been for General Sagat Singh, who was commanding 17th Division, I don't think the Indians would have given that kind of a response that finally ensued.
Right.
Nobody in India in 1967 could imagine that an artillery duel with the Chinese could leave hundreds dead on either side. And the casualty figures on the Chinese side were significantly higher than what we suffered. Sundarang-Chu, the Chinese did not anticipate the kind of muscular response that emerged following the occupation of a small hamlet within the Wangdong Bowl. But then General Sundarji, General Narhari, and General J.M. Singh put together an extremely proactive response, to the extent that in 1987, General Sundarji was asked by Delhi that, look, I think now you need to rein in your generals.
Right.
Because both General Narhari and General J.M. Singh were building up capability for a possible limited offensive across the line of actual control, which was unheard of in the 1980s.
Right.
So it's not that we have a complete strategic DNA of diffidence and restraint. The Indian military ethos is not one of only strategic restraint and diffidence. It is just that putting everything together as a whole of government package that demonstrates a proactive and an assertive approach is something which is still in the making. And I think, to be fair, to be very fair to the current, strategic dispensation, there have been several overt attempts to raise the proactive profile of India along the line of actual control and line of control. It is just that probably there is still a significant gap between intent and capability.
So how do we raise that capability, General Panag? What do we do there? Because the cost of war is enormous and no one understands it better than people like you who've actually fought wars. It's all very well. And I love the way General Panag consistently shuts down people on Twitter who talk to him about patriotism and nationalism. And kudos to you, General, for doing that. But the cost of war is so enormous, and our internal wars, forget our wars across the border, internal wars, and you know that better than most people. You've seen men die, you've seen families suffer. So what does one do where the cost of war is not as great as it is, and yet we have an aggressive intent, and we are able to show the world that we are, and it's important, as you said, right, Marshal, that we do need to show the world that we are an assertive power, if not an aggressive power, where the military is concerned. So, General Panag, what do we do?
Let me first link this question, the question that you have asked, to what Arjun just now said about the Sundrangshu. See, a very interesting point about Sundrangshu is that at the time of Sundrangshu incident, the Chinese GDP was only marginally higher than us.
Yeah.
Only marginally higher.
Yeah.
A big factor. The Chinese military was not as potent and as strong and as technologically advanced as it is today. In fact, let me say that at times we had edge over them. Because in that time, they did not even have the kind of transport aircraft that could transport their mechanized forces forward, and they would have had to move long distances by road, whereas we had that capability in terms of IL-76 aircraft and all that. And so the Chinese swallowed it. All our aggressive actions and our forward movement, both in Ladakh and there. And incidentally, it was the first time we were actually going for a forward posture. So that forward posture does not mean sitting on the LAC after 1962.
Right.
We had our defenses otherwise were way behind.
Right.
So, this is a big factor that today China's GDP is 5 times ours.
Yeah.
And even if let's say if our GDP goes up to even 5 trillion.
Right.
Our budget will double.
Yeah.
And from $46 billion, we'll go up to $100 billion.
That's right.
That is what the army feels it will require. And while we make much of pension bills and all those things are fine, that is because this is the budget. But if our GDP goes up, our economy goes up, automatically the defense budget will go up. Having said that, let me come back to this issue that the war has enormous cost today. Today, the number of people who die in battle, it is not only the numbers are not that high in terms of what has happened in the past. America left 58,000 dead in Vietnam alone. 58,000 dead in Vietnam.
Amazing.
So, but today, because of media visibility, today because of connectivity, every man, soldier who dies, in particular a soldier, because a soldier dies for the nation.
Yeah.
So it's not an accident. It's not something. It's not a disease. He dies for the nation. So it's an emotional factor, and so number of casualties is very, in terms of is a very major factor.
Right.
Then the other thing is the size. We are we have been arguing in the past that we are a manpower intensive army because we have to man it in mountains, this and that. That is because you want to approach it this way, that you want to hold the ground so that the enemy doesn't come, like in case of Pakistan, we are deployed all along the ails. But there are different ways of doing it.
That's right.
Right? You can, if you have a much more technologically advanced force, you have the surveillance means, you have a potent air element, a potent naval element who can exert pressure elsewhere. So the size of the man on the ground can reduce.
That's right.
And so that I think is a one factor. Then also our structures and organizations. I often say that India is fighting the fourth generation war, in our insurgencies. For the last 30, 40 years, we have been training and upgrading ourselves to fight the third generation war of maneuver.
Right.
That is, kind of conventional conflicts.
That's right.
And our mindset at times is of the second generation, going back to the First World War.
Right.
So a huge, gigantic organization is slow to respond, and much more money is spent on its maintenance than if you have a much smaller and a more potent force. Look at the Chinese. The Chinese used to at one time, have 4 million people under arms, even higher than the United States at its peak. And they have started reducing they have reduced the size of their formations. The group armies have become armies, and the divisions have been turned into combined armed brigades. Today, a corps of theirs or the army of theirs has got 6 combined armed brigades, whereas a corps of ours would probably have 3 divisions.
Right.
But they are technologically very advanced.
Right.
In Eastern Ladakh, the Chinese, as per my assessment, have used up to 3 to 4 combined armed brigades only in the front line. Obviously, if you are using 3 to 4 combined armed brigades up front, then you have to back them up with another 3 to 4 combined armed brigades.
Right.
So about 8 odd combined armed brigades. And we, at the peak, had pumped in 4 divisions.
Wow.
Almost, you can say 12 brigades, and much larger in size. Of course, they had a terrain advantage and they could be in certain positions, but we had to respond like that. And plus, we had to cater for a counteroffensive should we have to go in for. But what I'm trying to say is that even the Chinese, who were known for their mass, have reduced in size, made their armed forces more potent, and we are not attacking this problem, in a I would say in a determined manner.
Right.
And we talk about it, but we do not attack this problem in a determined manner.
Right.
Today, if I were to distribute the defense budget, I would put it Navy, Air Force, priority 1. That's technology.
Right.
What Navy can do in the seas to advance our national interest is far beyond what anybody else can do. I mean, what the ground forces can do. Air power.
Right.
I would have liked to see that today we had 130, 126 Rafales. That kind of, we would have had a quantum jump over our adversary.
Instead of this 36 we find.
Well, I'm not saying that 36 are also good, but this is what we require. But with the budget being spread out over an entire elephantine mass, there's very little left for anything else.
Right.
So we have to attack this problem. We have to reduce our size, optimize it. We are emotionally attached to it. If statistically, if you work out the number of casualties, the number of attacks, and how many people die, we are over-insuring. Whole world functions on 3 companies to a battalion. We function on 4. On the pretext of we'll have to put in more, we have to do this, we have to do that. It is illogical.
Right.
So I leave it at that to say that we need to put in a determined effort to cut down our size, improve our technology, and invest and put our money where it matters.
Right. Absolutely. And no one knows that better than Marshal Arjun Subramaniam. I think, you have been in the Air Force, so you understand why it needs much more support. I think the whole idea of integrated warfare and an integrated leadership that we've been talking about for the longest time. When will this actually start happening?
Okay. Let me touch on, let me take the conversation forward from where General Panag left it.
Yes.
And to my mind, I think we've taken a long time to shed many a predominantly colonial mindset when it comes to the prosecution of war. Now, even amongst the allies, even amongst the Japanese, even amongst the Americans and the Germans and the Japanese and the British, of all the four, the British were the least known to execute maneuver. Now, I think a similar mindset did steep into the Indian military after independence. And therefore, the word that I would like to use, that is the need of the hour, is greater flexibility and maneuver in the military mind.
Right.
Not entirely on the ground, not only on the ground or in the air or in the maritime domain, but also in the mind. Because what we are seeing increasingly with China is China is pushing as hard as possible to win without fighting.
Right.
Which means to say it is employing its vast resources and asymmetry to prosecute what I call all measures short of war.
Right.
Many people call it the gray zone. People call it hybrid warfare. Whatever name you give it. But all this involves a lot of improved maneuver in the mind. I think, based on several discussions that we have at the National Defense College, and I think this is rapidly seeping into the Indian military mind, and it is rapidly seeping even into the strategic establishment. So maneuver of the mind, the need for better technology, the need for downsizing and for balancing the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army. In theory, everyone understands it.
Right.
It is putting it into practice that offers the greatest, that offer the greatest stumbling blocks.
Yeah.
And that's what integration is all about.
That's right.
Now, if you look at it in terms of maneuver, maritime spaces and air spaces offer the maximum potential.
Yeah.
Offer the maximum potential.
Right.
Continental boundaries and frontiers and land is ideal for friction.
Yes.
So we have to move away from friction to maneuver, and that's where a little more understanding of the maritime and aerial domains must prevail within the warfighting community, not only the strategic establishment but also the warfighting community. For example, let me give you another analogy. Suppose the asymmetry between India and China is a given. Suppose we accept that leapfrogging is not going to reduce the asymmetry. And suppose we say that, look, given all this, what is it that is likely to influence the behavior of our adversary? In this case, if it is China. And to my mind, as an aerial warfighter, I would say that the one single aspect that is likely to influence the behavior of the adversary once we get into limited conflict or a skirmish or an engagement is firepower. How do you cause the maximum amount of combat attrition to a more powerful adversary in the shortest possible time so that you can get to the negotiating table at the earliest?
That's right.
To drive political outcomes.
Yeah. And we saw that. We've seen that. The 71 war, I think, was a classic example of that, wasn't it? Yeah. So do we, have we not learned anything from that? Is there a distinction between the political will and the military leadership? Does the political leadership, is it at odds with the military leadership?
No, I don't think the political leadership is at odds with the military. It is just that I think that we don't have a strong enough strategic bridge. And when I say strategic bridge, a strategic bridge is actually a robust connect between policymakers, strategy makers, and operational practitioners.
Right.
So mind you, the Indian politician is aware of the consequences of war and conflict.
Yeah.
And he's aware of the potential of the instrument of force at his or her disposal. So therefore, if I were to very briefly put my finger on where the problem is, I think the problem is in the strategic bridge.
Right. What do we do about that, General Panag?
Well, there are major national security reforms required, and one has to start with the higher direction of war as to our decision making process. At the moment, it remains very ambiguous. It lacks clarity. The National Security Council does not function the way it should be functioning. Take an example that the NSA was given the charter of working out the national security strategy in 2018.
Yeah, that's right.
But the national security strategy has not come out.
Yeah.
Well, if it's classified, I do not see what reason is there for it to be classified. Of course, always there are two aspects to a national security strategy: the classified portion and the public domain portion. The public domain, this thing lays out for the nation, for the public to know as to how we will respond in crisis situations. That's what, when you see the national security strategy of United States or even China, when you see it on the net, it gives you an indication as to how these nations will conduct themselves.
Right.
No, I find no reason as to why ours should not be in public domain.
Right.
So then, what about strategic reviews? What about the? You see, we created an army. We inherited an army. We kept on increasing it in size, and 62 forced us. So for a bygone era. Right. And mostly for a second generation transgressing into a third generation war. You know, we produced an army for that. Thereafter, we have hung on to it with our dear lives. Nobody has really bothered. Once a strategic review is carried out, a national security strategy is evolved. What kind of wars we are going to fight? How are we going to respond to crisis situations in future?
Yeah, that
will decide what kind of an army and Navy and the Air Force and other resources that you require.
Right.
And that's why when we talked about that, we focused on Air Force and the Navy. Why? Because it will straightway tell you that in the kind of warfare of the future, air power, missile power, cyber warfare, electronic warfare are going to be right up front, with which you can punish an adversary, without really moving masses of people forward. So this enmeshing the bridge that he talked about between the political leadership and the armed forces, and a kind of a synergy that should be there to bring about change and reforms is not there. We need to reform our higher direction of war, our decision making, and how we what we discuss, how we look at wars of the future, through a strategic review, national security strategy, and so on. This is a missing link.
Right.
Then you see again that our ministers our political leaders are too much involved in politics.
Right.
They spend very little time on their actual job.
Right.
And this in particular applies, I'm talking of the defense minister. In United States, the Secretary of Defense, he's a mover and a shaker.
Yeah.
He hardly gets involved in the party. You rarely find the president's cabinet getting involved in party affairs. That is left to so many other people who are there. And look at Rumsfeld is criticized for that his sort of reaching, bearing attitude towards the military. Look at the kind of reforms he brought about for the United States.
Right.
He brought them down from divisions and corps down to brigade combat teams, a more agile force.
Right.
And he was deeply involved in it. What is called the revolution in military affairs. Rumsfeld was deeply involved into it on day-to-day basis. So whereas it doesn't happen in our case. So there is a need to relook at how our political leadership looks at looks at their armed forces,
Right.
how this, the bridge between the two has to be sort of built, and it has to be, what should I say? It has to be formal. In 1962, when the Prime Minister Nehru said, throw them off the Thagla Ridge.
Right.
And so did Menonce. And these directions were given to General Thapar and to the DMO and also to General Kaul. But General Thapar, I granted to him that he said, let's have the order in writing.
Right.
Mr. Serene was the Joint Secretary then in the MOD. He sent out a 4-5 liner for the Indian Army to almost go to war with China.
Right.
Throw them off the Thagla Ridge. Though he left a very ambiguous thing. So does our government ever give a formal political directive? Or it is just General Saab kuch kar do, kar lo. But that is not. The government must give a political directive with political aim defined,
right.
which the military must translate into its the military aim of the conflict of use of force, for that matter. So this absence of directive, why do you think we do not reclassify our records?
Yeah, I mean, look at the Henderson Brooks of all of them. I mean, that is the
Henderson
most
Brooks
obvious.
report is a small thing. We don't even have an official history of 1971 war.
Yeah.
The history that has been published is unofficial. Published by retired officials of the Ministry of Defense, of the history division of Ministry of Defense. They are under their own name. It's nothing to do with the Ministry of Defense. So we don't even have a formal official history of 1970 war, the greatest victory of India.
Absolutely.
At all times. I would say it probably one of the greatest in our history, and probably one of the best in the world.
One of the greatest actually in the world. I mean, which war has actually created another nation like that?
This just shows how we view these things. Yeah. I mean, what will happen if the minutes of the meeting, which was chaired by Mrs. Gandhi, are made public today?
Right.
Then all these juvenile controversies about that Sam said this and Gandhi said this. I mean, these would get clarified.
Yeah.
And also, why not put out the directives of the Army headquarters, Naval Air headquarters, and what the people received and all that? Then only will you understand how it happened. But having said that, the 71 was still a job well done in terms of even at the higher level.
Yeah, of course. And Marshal, since you are a historian, I would like to bring you in here because as General Panag said, there's so much that is still unknown, or not known or not officially known. And we have this, and yet we have this new sort of emotional celebration of the soldier, in the new emerging India that you have, the celebration of the martyr, the celebration of the soldier, but that's a very emotional, it's not an intellectual exercise. And I think that is very significant. When do we become intellectual about it? I mean, when do we start becoming intelligent about it?
Before that, I just wanted to sort of offer a bit of a contrarian perspective to what General Panag mentioned. Now, he mentioned about, by no yardstick am I justifying the absence of a national security strategy or a national security doctrine. It is a must for a rising power and a power who wants to join the global stage.
That's right.
But having said that, look at the United States. Every year they come out with the National Security Review. They are the ones who coined the term, the revolution in military affairs. They are at the forefront of doctrinal advancement. But yet in the post-World War II era,
they've not won a single war.
Succeeded on the battlefield.
They've not won a single war.
Yes. So now when you discuss that within strategic circles, so Indian strategic circles have a fairly strong argument to say that, look, we haven't done too badly. We don't have a national security doctrine. We don't have a national security strategy. We like to keep our methods ambiguous. and it hasn't been too bad. It hasn't, it hasn't resulted in more than one real failure, which is 1962.
Right.
So it's a tough debate that is currently going on between those who believe in systems and processes, and they're very, very important. And that is why I'm also of the belief that you need to have a articulated strategy and a doctrine. And there is a very strong set of people who believe that we don't need to radically change what we've been doing so far because the results haven't been all that bad.
Right. Why fix something that ain't broken, you know?
Then there are arguments that say, who says India doesn't have a strategic culture? It has a strategic culture which is not articulated in writing, but it is there in the mind, and it is there when execution takes place. So, there are both these arguments. And therefore, I think what we really have is we are a typical raucous democracy, and we can't help that. And the second thing is, you asked me, is that how do we move away from jingoism and look? No, that will happen when the military is significantly detached from mainstream society. In India, one of the I think. And I think now you are seeing the military, which is representative truly of India. India with all its multicultural,
democratic diversity
society, no longer belong to affluent families who joined the military. Right. So that is one step in the direction that you're talking about.
Right.
The second set we're talking about is that during the early years after independence, we lived in a neighborhood that was stressed, that had a lot of military takeovers all around.
Right.
So a fledgling democracy with founding fathers who had an inherent dislike for the military because of what they had seen, their experience with the British.
Right.
So there was this attempt to say that, look, we need to at least, till Indian democracy is robust enough, we need to keep the military relatively isolated from civil society.
Right.
But I think that process, I think we are evolving in in a decent direction. And I think the military now is a significant part of civil society. But yes, I think there is a need to reflect on this unnecessary hagiography and eulogizing the military, particularly in times of crisis.
Right. Any closing thoughts, General Panag and Marshal?
I think what I would like to end by saying is that our military and our wars, it's been a mixed bag. And we haven't, I agree with Arjun entirely, we haven't done badly at all. 1962 war, the only major catastrophic defeat that we have suffered.
Right.
And even there, I would say that we lost the war, but we got the borders. What I'm trying to say is that we were, because of underdeveloped infrastructure, because of the, as we moved forward for the, during the forward policy, twice, up to 59, it was a traditional forward policy, mark the frontier. But beyond 59, particularly in 61, 62, it became contest the other side. Now that is what brought about the clash. But had Prime Minister Nehru not done this, then Chinese would have simply walked up to the areas, up to where we had the roads.
Right.
And we didn't have the roads almost to most of the places.
Right.
So even there, I would say we were defeated, but we got the borders.
Right.
Otherwise, the borders would not have been there.
Right.
And now, no matter what China does, barring all these pinpricks and all minor this thing that have been going on because of in Eastern Ladakh, I don't think China can really alter the LAC.
Right.
Territory is no longer an issue. What it has proven in Eastern Ladakh is what we had discussed earlier. Part of the talk was that modern the future of war, how the war is going to take place. China did a limited action.
Right.
It asserted itself.
Right.
It got its, proved the point about its 59 claim line and left it at that.
Right.
It doesn't want to do anything more.
Right.
Now both sides are facing each other because both are suspicious of each other. Okay, if you leave, then we'll do it, or he will leave, I'll do it, that kind of a thing. So I feel that, I mean, how can anybody imagine that China can come marching across with his might? Well, then, as nuclear weapon states, what have you got the nukes for?
Yeah.
Something that's unimaginable. So this is how it will happen, and this is how it happened.
Right.
I think that's what we should look at, the reform ourselves to fight the wars of 21st century.
Which are limited, which are shorter duration, which are aided by technological firepower. Those are the wars of the future.
Yes.
And which are about assertion, not necessarily just responding, which are proactive sometimes.
So, there are, I'd like to offer two closing points.
Yes.
The first is that I think 75 years is a good time to reflect on the role of the military in a democracy.
Yes.
And I think the Indian military has done a sterling job when it comes to upholding, protecting, and furthering democracy.
Absolutely. No question of that.
And the second point that I wanted to talk about, earlier on, we used to egg on troops and the forces by saying, together we fight and together we win.
Right.
Today, that dialogue has to be expanded significantly to encompass the whole of government.
Yeah.
It's only if there is a whole of government approach that understands the potency and the importance and the relevance of the instrument of force and statecraft, only then can we sort of imbibe this mantra of together we fight and together we win, but this togetherness is across the entire spectrum of government.
Yes.
Not just the three armed forces.
That's right. Wonderful. It was such a pleasure to talk to you both. Thank you so much for making time for us. And truly, I've learned so much, and I think our listeners will too. Thank you very much, General Panag. Thank you very much, Air Marshal. It was a true pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaveree. Thank you, General Panag.